Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mboris Podcast. This is Hashmat Mboris, your host. Today, guys, I'm so excited to welcome Beth Bailey, a journalist, a storyteller, and a host of the Afghanistan Project Podcast. Beth has dedicated her work to sharing the voice of Afghans' stories of courage, resilience, and humanity that often go unheard. Through her reporting and her podcast, she brings listeners closer to the lives behind the headlines, offering insights, empathy. Dear Beth, it's such a pleasure to have you tonight with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Hashmat. I'm really honored to be here and to get to talk about all the work that I've been doing for the last few years.
Thank you so much, dear, once again for joining us. But first of all, I would like to start from here, from your podcast, the Afghanistan Project Podcast, and the inspiration behind it. You know, the Afghanistan Project Podcast, I'm sure that it has touched the lives of many by showing, the human side of a country that the world often only sees through news and headlines. And starting such a project, I'm sure it requires a lot of curiosity and compassion and a deep sense of responsibility. I'm so curious to know that what personally inspired you to start the Afghanistan Project Podcast, and what was the moment or experience that made you feel this was a story that you had to tell?
That's a really good question, and it's a very interesting story, actually, how it got started. At it happened at a moment in my life when things were really in flux. I was going through the early stages of a divorce and was really struggling to kind of find my place in the world. And I happened to meet someone online who lived in the same area that I did and had gotten two of his interpreters out during the fall of the former Afghan government. And this man, Michael Cook, had started following me on social media, and I looked through his profile and saw that, oh my goodness, you live right near me in the middle of America, and there are a dozen Afghan children on your dock. What's going on here? And so he and I decided, we shared a passion for helping Afghans, and we met up for coffee one day. And we talked about intelligence supporting the military in that way. Um, and he said, you should start a podcast, because I had at that point probably written close to 60,000 words about post-withdrawal Afghanistan. And it was something that I cared about deeply. And it was the one thing that I had that kind of was keeping my brain together as the rest of my life fell apart. And I laughed it off. And I thought, who would ever want to listen to me talk about Afghanistan?
I
And
know.
then the interesting thing that happened that really pushed that along is that I had a neighbor of mine, a former neighbor, had made a really nasty comment in my presence about how he didn't think that any Afghans should be in the US. And I knew better than to try to, correct his thinking in that environment. But I thought, how could I correct that kind of thinking? And I thought the best way to do it was to tell stories in a different kind of way, because in the media, you're forced to kind of take people's whole life story and put multiple of those stories into a 700-word piece. And you don't really get to describe what's happening in a human's life that way. And so I called, or I texted Michael and I said, we need to meet. And I had written out on a piece of graph paper on one side all of the experts that I knew on Afghanistan who worked on various things, the SIV program or the US Refugee Admissions Program, or who were journalists, just all these people who I knew through my reporting. And then on the other side, I wrote the name of all of the Afghans who I knew had a really important story to tell too. And so Michael and I met for a beer, and I just said, hey, look, we have to do it. Like, we have to do the podcast. And I didn't know this until I think this past summer, but he said that the only reason that he agreed to do it is because he knew that I needed to do it. And
Wow.
so we did it together for the first probably year and a little bit more. And then I started doing it all on my own. And I love it. Every week getting to
Wow.
talk to someone I think I've had 126 episodes, like regular season episodes so far, and it never gets old because it's a great way to track what's happening in a really deep way instead of just doing it in the media. I think that together those two things are a really powerful way to impact the conversation about what's happening in Afghanistan.
Wow, such a great story, such an inspiring story actually. But I'm sure, dear Beth, that you know better than me that Afghanistan has gone through dramatic changes in recent years, and its people continue to face new challenges every day. And journalists and storytellers can help us, understand not just the events, but the experiences behind them. And I'm sure people like you in here can play, a very important role. From your work and reporting, how do you see Afghanistan today, personally? And what are some stories or realities that you feel that the world still doesn't understand about, the reality and what's happening right now in Afghanistan?
Well, I think that the country is in immense struggle. I think that economically it's not doing well because the Taliban have, kept basically half of the workforce from being able to work fully. And I don't think that the Taliban know how to administer a country in a successful way. I think that they know how to propel hate, and they're very good at that. But that is what they've done successfully in the country so far. And so I don't think that people understand fully how difficult it is to be a woman in Afghanistan. If they did, I think the world would be up in arms about what's happening to Afghan women in their homeland right now. I mean, the new criminal code that basically makes it more, you have more of a punishment if you harm an animal now than if you harm a woman in Afghanistan.
Exactly.
Slavery is now allowed inside Afghanistan. Just the things that the Taliban are openly saying about what they can do in this country now should have the entire world up in arms. So I think that just the level of struggle is not comprehended. And I think the real problem is that there are so many other issues in the world right now that the issues in Afghanistan just get pushed down and pushed down.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that terrorism has made a comeback inside Afghanistan. Terror groups are reforming there with the assistance of the Taliban in some cases, particularly Al-Qaeda. And I fear that what is going to happen again is another 9/11 style attack that forces the world to pay attention to Afghanistan, when if they just paid attention to Afghanistan now and did more to support the populations that are currently without access to food and the things that they need to survive without access to human rights, that perhaps we could stave off another attack like that and the need to participate, I hope never again, in a war that lasts for another 20 years. So yeah, that's, I think there are a lot of stories that don't get heard because the other thing the Taliban are doing right now is making it very difficult for women to share their voices. So while we know what's happening to women at large, it's very difficult to hear from women on the ground what exactly they're dealing with inside Afghanistan, because if they don't have access to a phone, they can't get a hold of somebody like me and tell me their stories. And I used to hear from a whole lot more women than I do now. And that's very concerning to me.
Mm-hmm. As I have read your background there, Beth, you have experience in journalisting and working as a freelancer and writing some papers for Fox News, BBC, and some other Western newses. I'm sure that every journalist has a story, about that, how they got started, what are, what drew to them to writing, reporting, or storytelling, and what keeps them actually to keep going despite of all these challenges. I'm curious, and I would like you to tell us, if possible, that can you share your journey in journalism and storytelling? What first personally drew you to this work, and how has your perspective evolved over time?
Yeah, it's a funny story how I came into journalism. I was not trained as a journalist. I was an intelligence analyst, intelligence community. I started writing a book about Afghanistan. And after I had my first child, it was really hard to write long form things. And so I knew an editor for a local paper, and she had always told me that if I wanted to write something short for her editorial section, that I should do that. And one day it just struck me that I really wanted to do that and try. And from there, I just got the bug, and I wanted to always be weighing in on what was happening in my state, what was happening around the world for veterans, or around the country for veterans, um, issues of anti-Semitism. And so I started basically just writing anywhere that would have me at first, and not for pay usually. But I loved it, and it was just a huge passion. And from there, I started writing for some bigger publications. I started actually making news in the editorial section. So it was very weird. I have the most non-traditional trajectory, I think, of anyone I've ever talked to. But I think it goes to show, when I first started, people would tell me, oh, no, it's just going to be a hobby for you. You'll be lucky to make enough money. Someone told me that he made enough money writing editorials that he could pay for his cigar habit every month. And I would love to talk to that person now and just say that, hey, I actually support my family with my writing now. If you find the thing that you're really passionate about, I think that you can do anything with writing, because people can feel it in what you're doing, that you have a passion for it, that you care. And I think that makes all the difference with anything that anyone does.
Yeah. I'm sure as a journalist and a storyteller, hearing the sad realities, hearing the sad stories of Afghan people, and hearing these stories can be both, I'm sure sometimes it's inspiring and sometimes it's, heavy and it's challenging. In your work as a host of Afghanistan Project Podcast, what are some of the untold or overlooked stories that have stayed with you, and why do you think it's important for the world to hear them now?
I want to say that some of the hardest stories that I've heard are stories I haven't even been able to share on the podcast, because it would endanger the people involved. And that is really tough. And every story that I've been able to tell matters to me. It's one of the interesting things about journalism is you're basically opening your heart to everybody that you talk to, and they become part of you. Their story becomes part of you. And it's an incredible honor to have that. And it's painful because you care about people, and they do go through so much difficulty. So it's hard for me to think of, all the stories are so compelling, but I think the one that really is closest to my heart is Passoon Khan, who came here on a special immigrant visa several years before the fall of the country, and has seen some of the worst fighting in the Afghan war, survived a suicide bombing, was incredibly, he lost his vision. He had to relearn how to walk. He is scarred from that bombing attack. And he decided, after the country fell, his father was stuck inside Afghanistan, and his father had been a colonel in the National Directorate of Security, and he was in incredible danger. And Passoon saw how his father was not doing well. And even though, it was a very dangerous thing for him to do it, he flew to Afghanistan and basically forced the State Department to fly his parents out of there. And I think it's the most brave thing that I have ever personally heard. I think of Passoon as just one of the most incredible humans ever. And yet there's a lot of hardship to that story too. He was not able to bring his siblings. One of his siblings was very young and had to stay with another sibling. And it was heartbreaking for his mother. His mother almost refused to go. And while he was there, one of his neighbors was trying to sell their daughter, for a dowry to make enough money to continue living. And Passoon just gave him money out of his pocket because he couldn't stand to see that happen. And so there's this immense bravery of what he did. And then there's so much hardship going on at the same time that it's just a story that I will never forget. And that doesn't even touch on the fullness of the things that Passoon did for American personnel while he was deployed. I mean, he's just an incredible human. And those kinds of stories, I'm so blessed to hear all of the time. It's been really incredible to hear those things. And yes, very heavy.
Yeah, these are the sad realities that unfortunately we're facing every day. You know,
Yeah.
working in journalists, especially on heavy and emotional topics that, as you have just said, I'm sure it's not easy. It's so difficult and it has its own, challenges and obstacles. I'm curious to hear that in this journey, would have been some of the challenging moments that you have come across in your reporting or in your podcasting.
It's all been so hard from the beginning. I think that anyone who has stuck with helping Afghans since August of 2021 has seen that it never got easier. Things only became progressively more difficult, and it just seems like there's more and more being lumped on top of you. But I will say that the last year was the most challenging of all. And there were moments where I felt completely hopeless. And I know that that wasn't helped by the fact that other advocates also felt hopeless, other Afghans also felt hopeless. And it was just this onslaught because of what was happening to, Afghans who had parole, who lost their parole over the last year, Afghans who had temporary protected status, who then lost temporary protected status, Afghans who were in the US refugee admissions program, who then completely, after 4.5 years of waiting on processing, were told there is no hope for you. And, had given up immense quantities of money to move to expensive places where they could be processed because they couldn't be processed in Afghanistan. People who were moved to Camp Silia, who were told, hey, now we're just going to shut down the camp. And they still don't know what country the State Department is going to send them to, which to me is just unconscionable. And some of those are the family members of US military personnel, to watch the special immigrant visa program shut down. I really sometimes I wonder what happened, because there was a moment last year where I thought I couldn't handle anymore. I was being interviewed by I think it was Paris 24, and I was doing the pre-interview call with the reporter, and I said, I don't know how dark you want me to get here. This is a story I was told yesterday, and it was about an attempted suicide, basically. And I relayed the story to this woman, and she said, you just say whatever, respond however the reporter asks you questions. And I said, okay. And I shut off the thing, and I just started sobbing because it was just too much. I had finally hit the point where like my heart was overwhelmed. And I don't know what happened from there, but giving up is just not an option either. And so I keep listening. I keep offering as much help as I can to people. And then I also recognize that, you have to find a way to manage it, because it's constantly overwhelming.
Yeah, of course. The work of reporting on complex and sometimes, painful stories requires personal drive and deep care. I'm really curious there, Beth. I'm really curious that what keeps you motivated personally to continue telling these stories, even when they are difficult and sometimes emotionally intense for you personally.
I think that's a really hard question to answer, because at this point, and I've been telling Afghans this for a long time, often when an Afghan tells me their story, they ask, will this make a difference? And I never want to say yes. I never want to give anyone false hope. I have never, that I can recall, had, a story about someone's SIV change the course of their SIV, for instance. However, it is important to maintain the hope that telling enough stories might change hearts and minds. And I think that the other thing here that's really important is that, journalism is the first draft of history. And if we don't tell these stories, then how are future generations going to know that not everyone was silent, as the world forgot Afghans, as we forgot the promises to our Afghans? I think the only way to make sure that history remembers the heroes who kept working hard to support Afghans, and I count among those all of the evacuation advocates that are in my close circle. I don't count myself in that number. Those are the people doing the really hard labor every day of making sure that people have a place to live, whether they're processing in Pakistan or in the US or inside Afghanistan, to make sure that they have food, to make sure that they have, a warm place to be. Making sure that those stories are also remembered, the people who have just endlessly given of themselves, to make sure that people often that they don't even know face to face are cared for. So yeah, it's that first draft of history and making sure that that's not forgotten.
Mhm. And as a last part of our meaningful conversation, Beth, I can say that your experiments can guide others who wants to make a difference through words, who wants to make a difference through storytelling and podcasting. What advice would you give to young journalists or storytellers who want to shed light on underrepresented voices that and complex issues like those in Afghanistan?
So I would say, I think my story is particularly a good example of this. Find the thing that you're obsessively passionate about and follow it, because that's when my writing really changed, was when I started writing about Afghanistan. And it was just immediately apparent because the number of people who wanted to share their stories with me, the number of people who were now becoming part of my circle, it was just expanding exponentially. So when you find your thing, there are just signs from the universe that like you're there, that's it. And it changes the quality of what you're doing, and people can read that. So, and I think it's important to, if you're a journalist and storyteller, being able to mix those personal stories, talking to people on the ground and gaining their trust, and in return being careful and honoring their stories. When you do that, you create this symbiotic relationship, and you make not just a news story. It's not just this is happening across the world. You're taking someone's experience and showing that to the reader as well. I think that's so important, to be able to really make an impact on a reader. You need to make them feel the experience of another human so that they can understand that situation more deeply.
Thank you so much once again, dear Beth, for taking the time to share your insights and experience with us today. And your work as a host of the Afghanistan Project Podcast goes far beyond journalism. And thank you once again for doing what you're doing. And the care and the responsibility with which you amplify, Afghan voices is deeply inspiring for me personally, even. And we are really grateful for your work and for this conversation. But at the end, if there's anything that you would like to share with your sister, or if there's anything, or if you have a message for your sisters inside and outside Afghanistan, mic is yours. You can tell in.
Thank you so much. I would just love to say, as I mentioned earlier, I have not heard from as many Afghan women inside of Afghanistan as I once did. And I would just be honored to lift up Afghan women's voices right now and help the world understand what it is like to be an Afghan woman. Because right now we're hearing that from, these adventure journalists who want to go to Afghanistan and pretend like, oh, look, Afghan women are living normally. And we know that's not true. And I think the best way to counter that narrative, which only benefits the Taliban, is to share stories. And Zon Times does a beautiful job of that, and Afghanistan International, and, 8 a.m. media. But I would love to be part of that too. So any Afghan women who want to reach out, I would just be honored to understand your experience and help tell your stories even more.